Daniel had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his days, a life of quiet sacrifice where every decision revolved around the needs of his two young daughters. His mornings were filled with hurried breakfasts, backpacks being slung over tiny shoulders, and a constant reminder that he had to be both mother and father in their world. He had long ago given up the luxury of dreaming for himself. Survival and the laughter of his children were all that mattered. The weight of bills, the late nights at work, and the emptiness of his bed had become his normal. It was not bitterness that shaped him, but resilience, a determination to provide his daughters with a sense of safety and love, even if he felt hollow inside. And yet, he could not have imagined that one ordinary evening would unravel everything he thought he knew about life and love. When Daniel stopped on that dark roadside to help the injured woman, he thought of it as nothing more than an act of instinct, the same instinct that drove him to protect his children. She was pale, frightened, and vulnerable, and though her clothes and jewelry whispered wealth, none of that mattered in that moment. He only saw a human being clinging to life. The ambulance had come, the doctors had taken over, but her eyes, those tired, haunted eyes, had clung to his with a silent plea he couldn't shake. It was a look that stayed with him long after the night ended, a look that made him feel as though his simple act of kindness carried more weight than he understood. Days passed, and Daniel went back to his small, humble routines, but fate refused to let their lives drift apart. A message came through the hospital, a request for him to visit. At first he hesitated, wondering why someone like her, with all her money and connections, would want anything to do with a man like him. He worried about wasting time he didn't have, about exposing his daughters to a world they didn't belong in, but curiosity and a sense of unfinished responsibility tugged at him. When he walked into her hospital room, he wasn't met with the distant arrogance he expected. Instead, he found a woman stripped bare of pride, grateful and strangely alone. She thanked him with a voice still frail from the accident, her words trembling with sincerity. Daniel brushed it off, insisting anyone would have stopped to help, but she smiled at him with an expression that suggested she knew better. Most people, she said, would have kept driving. In that moment, he felt an invisible thread tie itself between them, something unspoken yet undeniable. He didn't know her story, and he didn't pry, but he saw the loneliness in her eyes, a loneliness that mirrored his own. What began as brief visits became something neither of them had planned. She asked about his daughters, and he spoke with the unguarded warmth of a father who lived for their laughter. She asked about his life, and though he tried to downplay his struggles, the honesty in his voice betrayed the hardships he carried. In return, she opened pieces of herself, speaking of a life filled with riches but empty of true companionship, of betrayals that had cut deeper than the wounds from her accident. She had lived in houses too large to feel like homes, and moved through circles filled with people who loved her wealth but never her heart. For the first time, someone looked at her not as a millionaire, but simply as a woman, fragile and searching for connection. Daniel didn't realize when the visits stopped being a duty and became something he looked forward to. His daughters, curious and innocent, eventually met her, and the bond that formed between them startled him. She listened to their endless chatter, laughed at their silly jokes, and treated them with a tenderness Daniel hadn't seen from anyone outside their small family. His girls began to ask about her constantly, their excitement at seeing her reminding Daniel that maybe, just maybe, this woman was becoming part of their world in ways he hadn't anticipated. Still, Daniel wrestled with doubt. He wondered what she truly saw in him, a man with calloused hands and a modest paycheck, someone who had no power to impress in the glittering world she belonged to. He worried about what would happen when she recovered fully and returned to her life of privilege. He had seen people like her in magazines, living lives so distant from his own that it seemed foolish to even imagine they could intersect. And yet, each time she looked at him with gratitude, and something deeper flickering in her gaze, the walls around his heart began to crack. The more time they spent together, the more he realized she wasn't looking for luxury or grand gestures. She seemed drawn to the simple ways he lived, the genuine laughter of his daughters, the warmth of a dinner cooked at home, the comfort of a life built not on wealth, but on love and resilience. For her, it was like discovering a world she never knew she needed, a reminder of the humanity money had never been able to buy. For him, it was terrifying, because it meant daring to believe in a future beyond survival. One night, as they sat together watching his daughters play, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. She told him that in the moment he stopped on that roadside, he didn't just save her life, He gave her something she thought she had lost forever, the chance to feel truly seen. Daniel, unprepared for the weight of her confession, felt his chest tighten with emotions he had buried for years. He realized then that what began as an act of compassion had blossomed into something far more profound, something that might change the course of both their lives. Daniel's story had always been one of endurance, of pushing through hardship for the sake of his children, but now it was being rewritten. The woman he had rescued was not just recovering from an accident, she was teaching him to hope again. And though neither of them knew what the future held, both understood that destiny had chosen that dark roadside for a reason, binding their lives together in ways neither could have predicted. For the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to dream, not just for his daughters, but for his own heart. When Daniel pulled the woman from the wreckage that night, he thought it was a simple accident, one of those unfortunate events that happen on lonely roads. But as the days passed and her strength returned, fragments of her story began to surface, revealing that her injuries were not the random consequence of bad luck. There were details that didn't add up. The deliberate way her brakes had failed, the lingering fear in her voice when she spoke of those who surrounded her, and the strange silence from people she thought would come rushing to her side. Daniel didn't understand it all at first, but he could sense that she carried more than physical wounds. She was living in the shadows of betrayal, and he and his daughters had unknowingly stepped into the middle of it. At first, she tried to brush it off, insisting she had simply lost control of her car. But Daniel had spent years reading people, not because he wanted to, but because life as a single parent demanded it. He could tell when his daughters were hiding tears behind forced smiles, and he could tell when this woman was concealing something much darker. It wasn't until one late evening, when his daughters had gone to bed and the silence of his modest home wrapped around them, that she finally allowed the truth to slip through trembling lips. Someone close to her, someone she trusted, had wanted her gone. The words stunned Daniel. He couldn't fathom a world where wealth could twist love into greed, where family and friends might turn into predators the moment money was involved. She spoke of business partners who envied her power, of relatives who believed her fortune should have been theirs, of a life spent surrounded by smiles that hid sharpened knives. For the first time, Daniel realized that saving her that night was more than a simple act of kindness. It was the beginning of a battle he hadn't asked for, but could no longer turn away from. He wanted to walk away, to shield his daughters from the danger that now pressed against their doorstep, but something inside him refused. He knew too well what it felt like to stand alone against the world, and he couldn't bear to abandon her to the very forces that had already tried to destroy her. Instead, he chose to stand by her side, though he had nothing to offer but courage and loyalty. It was not money or influence that gave him strength, but the fierce devotion of a father who had fought for survival long before she came into his life. As her world began to unravel, Daniel's daughters became her unexpected sanctuary. Their innocence, their laughter, their unshakable trust reminded her of everything she had been missing in the cold halls of her wealthy existence. But danger was never far away. There were strange cars parked too long near Daniel's home, anonymous calls that went silent when answered, shadows that seemed to follow her whenever she stepped outside. What terrified her most was not just the threat itself, but the knowledge that it came from people she had once loved, people who knew her routines and weaknesses intimately. Daniel's life, once centered only on quiet routines and the simple struggles of providing for his family, now bristled with unease. He found himself checking the locks twice at night, peering through curtains when he thought no one was watching, and keeping his daughters close at all times. Fear became a constant companion, yet it only deepened his resolve. He realized that his act of kindness had tied their fates together, and no matter what, he would not let harm come to her. The more he learned, the more he admired her resilience. She had been born into wealth but had fought to build her own empire, carving a path in a world that doubted her. Yet with every victory came more enemies, and those enemies had finally struck with a cruelty that stripped away her illusions. Still, she did not crumble. With Daniel by her side, she began to find strength in vulnerability, allowing herself to trust someone who had nothing to gain from her downfall or survival. Their bond deepened not in moments of safety, but in moments of fear. There were nights when Daniel sat awake long after his daughters had fallen asleep, listening to her speak about betrayals that cut deeper than her wounds. She confessed the loneliness of being surrounded by people who never truly cared for her, and he confessed the exhaustion of raising children alone with no one to lean on. In those confessions, they found something unbreakable, a shared understanding that trust, once earned, was the most precious currency in the world. But the danger did not fade. It escalated. Anonymous letters appeared, warning her to stay silent about what she knew. Once, Daniel came home to find his front door ajar, his daughters frightened but unharmed, a chilling reminder that they were being watched. It was then that he realized their lives were no longer simply intersecting. They had become entwined in a struggle that demanded courage neither of them had expected to summon. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a strange kind of beauty. She taught his daughters to believe in possibilities beyond survival, offering them glimpses of a future filled with opportunities they had never imagined. They, in turn, gave her something her wealth had never been able to buy, a family that loved her without condition, without expectation, without fear of losing her fortune. For Daniel, the shift was profound. What began as an act of compassion had become a journey of transformation, pulling him into a world of danger, but also into a love that was rooted in trust and sacrifice. Every choice Daniel made from then on carried more weight. He was no longer just a father trying to shield his daughters from life's hardships. He was a man standing against forces that thrived on greed and betrayal, a protector not just of his children but of the woman whose life he had saved. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew something he hadn't dared believe before, that love, in its truest form, had finally found him. And though shadows lingered around them, threatening to swallow everything, Daniel understood one thing with absolute clarity: their lives had changed forever, and he would face whatever came next with unwavering strength, because some bonds were worth risking everything for.